Hey guys, I gave a talk at a conference for food and drug officials from different states about mushrooms in the food system, and I thought it would be a good idea to go ahead and share that with others as well. I think there may be more broad interest. It certainly is something that's changing pretty dramatically here in the United States and around the world. Anyway, without further ado, here is the talk that I gave at that conference called Mushrooms in the Food System: How Do We Approach a Food That Most of Us Don't Understand? All right, what can you expect to get from this talk? I had 1 hour to give this talk, so I wanted to fit a lot in. And initially, I was going to make it pretty data heavy and give a lot of information, a lot of graphs. But an hour is not enough time to really convey details, so I settled on a vibes talk. So, my hope is that you leave this with a general notion of the state of things and that you'll be motivated to learn more. And so I'm going to start out looking at global trends in research on fungi. And I say leaving aside fungal plant pathogens because a lot of people in their biology training learn about fungi mainly as plant pathogens and don't learn a lot about other fungi. So I know I myself, in the process of getting a master's degree in biology, I had maybe maybe a half of one day's lecture in freshman biology, specifically about fungi. And other than that, the only real formal education I had on it during that whole time was as plant pathogens in a graduate level botany class. But I think that looking at fungus research gives you a good idea of where things are heading, uh, from certainly from the supply side, where producers are, and then with a little bit of lag, it shows where the demand is as well. Because if there is a demand, eventually the producers will get there. And you'll see during this that there's a very sharp divide between what's going on in research in developed countries like the United States and what's going on in developing countries. And to understand a lot of this, we need a quick biology lesson. First of all, mushrooms are just a fruit, they are there for sexual reproduction. Um, and they are growing from a body that is there even when the mushroom itself is not. That body is called a mycelium. It's made up of threads called hyphae. And the way mushrooms do their sexual reproduction is via spores, which almost entirely are carried by the wind. There's some where that's not the case, but most of the mushrooms in the food system, the spores are intended to be carried by the wind. And so, our first aside of the presentation, I like this picture. This is a group that I had out foraging. This was a certification class getting certified to collect and sell wild mushrooms in North Carolina. And while we were out there, we saw these oyster mushrooms growing on the side of this tree. And you can see coming off of these mushrooms, you can see spores wafting out, which is really cool, and leads me to this study: mushrooms as rainmakers, how spores act as nuclei for raindrops. Which reminds me of something I'd heard a couple years ago, scientists suggesting that part of the reason that the Blue Ridge Mountains are smoky, appear smoky, is the spore load from particularly oyster mushrooms creating so much, consolidating so much moisture around them. Um, so I thought that was pretty interesting. So the mushrooms themselves are for sexual reproduction. Mushroom cultivators in generally don't use sexual reproduction. Uh, a lot of people think that mushroom cultivators work from spores, but they don't. They almost entirely work by cloning. And in the picture on the left, you can see some grains that are intended to be used as mushroom spawn. And the fungus, the culture, is growing those, the mycelium, the hyphae, are growing into those grains, and they will eventually, that whole jar of grains will end up being invaded by that fungus. I say invaded, basically they're using it as a food source. And then when you break up those grains and drop them into an appropriate substrate, like on the right, the fungus will then grow outward from the grains into the substrate, which is what you can see is happening on the right. So as far as what an appropriate substrate is, this picture is of a meadow mushroom, which is one of the agaricus mushrooms like buttons, portobellos, crimini. For them, an appropriate substrate is composted manure. They're what's called secondary decomposers, because plant matter has gone through the digestive system of something like a cow, and the microbes in the digestive system broke down that material, and then somebody collected what came out the other end of the cow, composted it, and grew mushrooms on that. So it's the second time it's getting decomposed. But most of the gourmet mushrooms that are currently being cultivated are primary decomposers. It's the first time that plant matter is being decomposed. So in nature, these are things that you mostly would find growing on dead wood. And here's an example of that where we're growing shiitakes on logs on the left, and on the right are various mushrooms that we're growing, that instead of growing them on logs, we're growing them on sawdust in a controlled environment. And then another source of nutrition is having relationships with plants. And this is very common. It's called mycorrhizal. Myco meaning fungus, rhizome referring to roots. And mycorrhizal relationships are very important in the plant world. Over 90% of plants are dependent on them. But in this relationship, fungi that are growing through the soil just form relationships with plant roots. And they kind of make a deal that the fungus will give the plant some of the stuff it's collecting through that network in the soil. And then the plants, in turn, will give the fungus some of the sugar that it's producing from carbon dioxide, water, and sunlight. So it's kind of a win-win for them. All right. So, like we said, most of the gourmet mushrooms are growing on plant matter. And so here is a study that's typical of what's going on in the developing world. Utilization of areca nut leaf sheath and orange peel as environmentally friendly alternative substrates for cultivating Pleurotus austratus. Pleurotus austratus is just the tree oyster, really commonly cultivated. Here in the United States, if you got on some social media forum for mushroom growers and said, how should I grow my oyster mushrooms? People will tell you exactly, they will tell you master mix, and they'll tell you where you should order your soy hull pellets from, and pretty much everybody gets these things just shipped to them. It's really standardized here because of the availability. In developing parts of the world, there may not be the same availability of the materials, but there is availability of other things. So there's a lot of studies looking at how people can use locally available resources, especially things that are already byproducts of local agriculture. And, the same thing works here. Here's a project my son did for 4-H a few years ago, where after we harvested garlic, he took the stalks and grew oyster mushrooms on the garlic stalks. Just stuffed them in a gallon Ziploc bag, and they grew nice oyster mushrooms. Here's another one where they're using sugarcane, bagasse, and banana leaves. Sugarcane, bagasse, is the sugar cane gets kind of gets kind of crushed and water rinsed through it to basically wash the sugar out, and you're left with all this plant pulp. Uh, and so using that plant pulp to grow oyster mushrooms would be a great thing. Here's another interesting waste product. I decided last January that it would be cool to shred all of our office paper waste and then just try growing mushrooms on it as is. I didn't supplement it with anything. I took that paper waste and I pasteurized it and hydrated it, and then just added some spawn to it to see what it did, and it grew these gorgeous golden oyster mushrooms, which I didn't eat because I don't know if there may be some material, some compounds in waste paper that would get taken up into the mushrooms. And I, in fact, reached out to several food chemistry labs to see if I could get anybody to bite on maybe checking it out. And maybe there's a grad student somewhere who would want to work with us on this, and I didn't even get any responses. But a few months later, I saw this article coming out of Eritrea: performance of waste paper as a substrate for oyster mushrooms. And they very specifically talked about how, even in the developing world, there's tons of waste paper, and this could really be beneficial for food security and for economic security if they could use that to grow mushrooms. And unfortunately, with this study, they also did not look at the safety of eating mushrooms grown on waste paper. So, still an open question as far as I'm concerned, but it's knowable information, and I hope someday it will be known. Here's another one where they're very specifically talking about advancing sustainable mushroom production in developing countries, a pathway to nutritional security and economic growth. Mushrooms are seen as a way toward nutritional security and economic growth, which is an interesting contrast to here in the United States. Mostly gourmet mushrooms are something that are only available really even to people with quite a bit of disposable income. Here's a couple where they talk about empowering rural economics and mushroom farming for youth empowerment. And they talk about the minimal land requirements. It takes very little space to grow mushrooms. You could grow 100 pounds of mushrooms a week in well under 50 square feet of indoor room space. It does not take much room at all. A term that comes up really commonly in these kind of studies is valorization. It's a good one to know. Valorization is where you take something that is considered waste, something that basically waste means a problem. And you reframe that, you find a way to give it value. So valorization is taking something that was considered garbage or waste and therefore a problem and reframing it as something valuable. So, for example, if you have sugarcane bagasse as a waste product of growing sugarcane, that's a problem. But if you can reframe it as a resource for a substrate for growing mushrooms on, it's no longer a waste product. It's now a valuable resource for growing mushrooms, which can have value nutritionally and economically. And to take that even a step further, beyond just taking a product from farming and using that to grow mushrooms, you'll see a lot now about circular bioeconomy. And circular bioeconomy is where you create basically a virtuous circle where one product produces something that is useful for another product, and eventually it leads all the way back to where you're producing something that's useful for the first product. And so spent mushroom substrate is a key part of that. The material that's left over after you grow mushrooms on that lignocellulosic waste, that spent mushroom substrate, turns out it's very valuable. Is a great soil amendment. If you plant tomatoes with that on the soil instead of just regular soil, it reduces that blossom end rot that a lot of us get in our tomatoes. You can see that picture on the right is worms growing through spent mushroom substrate. Worms love it. And I'm going to give you an example here where when we started out cultivating mushrooms indoors, we were growing on straw, and I would go to our local southern states and I'd get a 30-pound bale of straw. It cost me $6. On that 30-pound bale of straw, I could use that to grow over 30 pounds of mushrooms. But let's say 30 pounds of mushrooms, and I would take those mushrooms to the farmer's market, to some restaurants, and 30 pounds of mushrooms, of oyster mushrooms. I would figure on average between the farmer's market and the restaurants, I'd figure on average we'd get $10 a pound. So from that $6 bale of straw, we're producing $300 worth of mushrooms. At the end of it, we've taken straw, which the reason it's only $6 is because it's only useful for animal bedding. It's not digestible to any animals. Nothing can eat it. But after you grow oyster mushrooms on it and they break down the lignocellulosic material in there, they are breaking down the stuff that's indigestible. And what they're leaving behind is something that is digestible. And we could take that spent mushroom substrate, that straw that's been eaten by the oyster mushrooms that we've already got $300 worth of mushrooms off of, and we could then feed it to pigs, and they would eat it and they can gain weight on it. And there's studies on this too. Full disclosure, the pigs didn't love it. We would have to mix their regular feed in with it, but they would eat it. So here you've got a circular bioeconomy where you could grow wheat, harvest the wheat, take the straw that's left over, feed that to pigs, grow mushrooms on it, take the spent mushroom substrate from that, feed it to pigs, and then take the spent mushroom substrate that's whatever they didn't eat and whatever came out of the other end of the pigs, and compost all that and put it back on the field to help grow more wheat. And you've got a full circular bioeconomy. And you can find a lot of information about spent mushroom substrate if you want to. There's a lot of good stuff out there. So everything that's being learned in developing countries from these studies can be applicable here in the United States too. We've got all the same problems that developing countries have, most of the same problems. It's just that they're more isolated, I guess you could say. But we've got poverty, we've got food insecurity, and we've got waste happening here in the United States. We could apply this stuff here. To kind of turn it around now, in the developing world, this is more typical of the kind of studies that are coming out. There's more of a focus on technology. So this is kind of typical study involving tiny machine learning, and then the Internet of Things is a big phrase that shows up a lot in studies here. I'm not personally super opposed to technology. This is a growing setup I've got in my living room, an automated growing setup that I built using mostly repurposed stuff from Goodwill and the Habitat for Humanity Restore. It's great if you've got the technology to do that. But taking that technology focus on further, now what we're starting to see is that people that hear about the rise in interest in mushrooms are able to buy something like this $250,000 shipping container system that basically is a plug and play mushroom farm. If you don't have $250,000 to spend on it, you can lease to own for a little under $3,500 a month for that system. You'd have to grow a lot of mushrooms in there to even pay off that part of it. But you can also get on Alibaba now, and there are lots of places, especially in China, that will send you a pretty cheap shipping container that's set up, ready for you to grow mushrooms from it. And I would say with these things, they kind of get you around one of the primary um, hardships in getting a mushroom farm started, which is knowing how to do it. People now with very little knowledge, but with some startup funding, can get these systems. I don't know if that's a good thing or not. I suspect it's a bad thing. But so far, most of the local gourmet farmers markets and local groceries too, they're dominated with very local small farms. Um, but that's changing. They say the future's here. It's just not evenly distributed. In Southern California, certainly we're seeing some of these sort of factory farms come up. I know there's at least one place outside of Atlanta that's growing this way, and not only in a factory farm type of system, they're actually getting their substrate is coming from China already. It's already inoculated. They're sending it refrigerated in shipping containers all the way from China across the ocean on big ships, rather than just using local material. It's I don't know. To me, that's troubling. All right, so that's where the current state of research is, looking at new substrates, integrating mushrooms with traditional crops, environmental benefits of growing mushrooms, food and economic security, and then a lot of tech integration and automation. But culturally, this is where we still are. If you go into any typical grocery store, you'll find that what they have for mushrooms is pretty much dominated by agaricus, the button mushrooms, portobellas, and crimini, which are really all the same mushroom. Um, so the variety is not there. The understanding of how to use those mushrooms isn't there. So the food system in general relies on knowledge and integrity and expertise of the people bringing that food into the system. And that's even more true uh, with mushrooms. And I'll tell you, this slide, I showed this at this food conference and just asked if anybody in the room, if any of the people from these 12 states and territories who are food and drug officials could identify all four of these wild mushrooms. And there was not a single person in the room who could identify these. Uh, and these represent a quarter of the wild mushrooms that in North Carolina can legally be collected and sold into the food system by somebody with the proper training. And I don't say that to throw shade on the food and drug officials, just that oversight is not really there because nobody in the system, except for some people who are out foraging, really knows the mushrooms. Uh, Closer to home, though, a lot of people do know these. These are morel mushrooms, but a lot of people don't know that morel mushrooms are really dangerous. And To exemplify that, here is a report from the CDC, sort of an after action report about a mass poisoning that happened in Montana at the end of 2023 over the course of 2 days, where morels were sold at a restaurant. They were prepared at a restaurant and served, and 51 people died. 51 people were sickened and 2 people died from these 2 days of serving morels. And at the time that it happened, the popular media, the stuff we were hearing about it, like this article in People magazine, talked about how the mushrooms sold at the restaurant were likely sourced from China. A lot was made about these being possibly Chinese mushrooms. Here's another one. Business Insider. The restaurant said in an Instagram post that they believe the common ingredient was cultured morel mushrooms imported from China via a distributor in California. When I heard about it on NPR, same thing. NPR reported that it would appear that the mushrooms were sourced from China. Nobody that I heard or saw was mentioning the fact that they were morel mushrooms, which are inherently dangerous if you don't know how to deal with them. The idea of these being cultivated, just kind of a callback to earlier when we talked about what a growing substrate is for mushrooms. Most morel mushrooms are mycorrhizal. They grow in association with plant roots. Black morels, though, actually can be, to some extent, can grow on material in the soil. So the biggest black morels I've ever found were in a bag of mulch from Lowe's, growing directly out of a bag of mulch. And because black morel mushrooms are less dependent on those relationships, there was a Danish morel project which developed over the last probably 30 years, developed really good cultivation techniques that allow cultivation of black morels. It's a complicated process, but the Chinese have picked up on this process, and there are a lot of cultivated morels coming out of China now. But the problem is not that they're coming out of China. The problem is that they're morels. So the end of the report from the Centers for Disease Control really talks about the need for educating people about morels and the need to cook them. The fact is that raw morels are toxic, and both days that those morels were served at that restaurant in Montana, one day they were served completely raw. The other day they were served after having some kind of a boiling liquid poured over them, and they were allowed to sort of steep in that liquid for a while, but they weren't well cooked. And they need to be well cooked to cook the toxins out. And this is something that culturally a lot of people don't know. So it's not enough to be able to identify mushrooms. You have to know how to use them. Another example of this happened in 2018 or 2019 in Spain. A Michelin-starred chef at a restaurant in Spain sickened, in this case, sickened 30 people, and I think one or two died in this one. And again, it says down at the bottom, mushrooms apparently had not come from Spain or from Europe, but were from China. And in this case, there's no CDC after action report on it because the CDC is an American thing. And I don't know if there's an equivalent in Spain or in the European Union. But when they reviewed this, they found no fault. And in fact, the chef was allowed to keep his Michelin star. And they never say anything in here that I saw about the morels being undercooked, but I feel almost certain that they were undercooked for this to have happened. Another example with a different mushroom. This is out of Australia, and this is where some death caps were cooked and served accidentally by a chef who he was a Chinese of Chinese ancestry anyway. And he collected some of these thinking they were paddy straw mushrooms and cooked them for a special meal for some of his coworkers and killed two of his coworkers. Mistaken identity. There are these mushrooms that are commonly used in Asian food, paddy straw mushrooms, that, like death caps, start out growing inside this egg-like structure called a vulva. And uh, he apparently found these, and because of their similarity in the way they start out, the similarity to the paddy straws, which are highly prized, he thought that's what they were and served them. Um, Less accidentally, there's a case going on right now in the news of an Australian woman who intentionally served death caps to her ex-husband's family and killed some of them. And interestingly, this is a case where what I saw of it, there was an expert, a mushroom expert, testifying that he had found death caps at the location where she had collected hers, and he had posted his find on iNaturalist, which is a website where you can post things that you find. Anyway, it would appear that she saw that he had posted it on iNaturalist and then went and collected them and served them. The other interesting thing is one of the women who died reported that apparently the meal was delicious. So death caps will not let you know by being unpalatable that they're dangerous. So you got to know what you're doing. Um, there is, even though we don't have in America a big tradition of using mushrooms, other countries do, and some have even cultivated it while not having traditionally had that traditional knowledge. And this example is the Finland, where they tried in the late 1800s and early 1900s. They tried during times of real food shortages to get people to start using wild mushrooms to alleviate some of that shortage. Didn't have much luck until after World War II, when some Karelians, which are like Russian people within a border region, Karelia, relocated into Finland and brought their knowledge with them. And then Finland really doubled down and they started sending experts out throughout the country to educate people. And they've created a real culture of wild mushroom usage. And that's something we could do here too. If we prioritized it, we could do that. So I want to take a look at the cultural forces that are driving changes in how mushrooms are viewed and used. And this picture is a picture of the town where I came of age, Nortonville, Kansas. And this picture is from from less than 10 years ago. It looks exactly like it did 40 years ago. Uh, when I grew up there was no social media. And so in Nortonville, Kansas, we didn't know what people around the country were eating. We didn't have that kind of influence. We had influence from, some TV stations that came out of Topeka or Kansas City, whatever was on TV, or, if we went to a movie, but there was definitely no social media. But if I lived in Nortonville, Kansas right now, I would be seeing the same stuff that everybody else in America is seeing. These influencers that are showing these fantastic looking dishes with, in this case, chestnut mushrooms and lots of other cool stuff. There's fried plantains on there. I'd never heard of that. There's avocados. I'd probably heard of avocados, but I doubt that I'd ever seen them. I don't think the little grocery store uptown in Nortonville had things like that. But now there is a push There's social pressure. Everywhere there is social media, which is everywhere, driving an interest in mushrooms. Similarly, there's an interest in everything outdoors. Doing things for yourself, including collecting food, is becoming much more popular, and people are getting a lot of advice, good or bad, about how to do that. There's a lot of social media out there pushing the health benefits of mushrooms. There's a lot of um, uh, medicinal food influencers that are encouraging people to start getting medicinal mushrooms. And many medicinal mushrooms are also culinary mushrooms. And there's some really borderline or across the border dangerous influencers that are peddling really dangerous things, like this person who's waxing poetic about using fly agaric, which is a relative of death cap and is toxic, and does cause hallucinations, which I guess for some people is the point, to hallucinate. But it's toxic also and can be dangerous, to the point where late last year the FDA had to put out this alert letting everybody know that fly amanita is not safe. And they had to do this, and it's not approved for use in anything. And they had to do this because fly agaric has started showing up in products that are in gas stations and vape shops and those kind of things, because of social media influence pushing people to think that they should try seeing what it feels like to be under the influence of fly agaric. Uh, Here's another similar one that I thought was interesting from a couple weeks ago. These hikers ate some psilocybin mushrooms and then went for a hike and decided while they were on the hike that somebody in their party was actually dead, and called 911 to report that one of their members had died. And then the rescuers showed up and discovered that nobody was even injured. They were just convinced that they had a dead person with them, and they were able to rescue them and get them back down the mountain. Uh, so, yeah, not a great not a great thing to be pushing influence for people to want to do dangerous things like take hallucinogenics and then go hiking. Uh, More pressure on people from fantastic fungi and shows like this that are showing up, like on Netflix. I'm not saying it's a bad thing. I'm just saying that I've seen a lot of more interest in fungi because of these sort of shows. And then there are a lot of books as well, like Entangled Life, that are really getting people more aware of fungi and more interested in learning more about them and in incorporating them more into their lives, including on TikTok. The young people on TikTok are getting on board with it too. So lots of people now are drinking these mushroom coffees, and the mushrooms that are commonly used in these mushroom coffees. There's a lot of evidence that there's good stuff about them. Um, in general, ergothioneine is a compound that we know our cells have active receptors on the surface of the cells to take up this compound, ergothioneine, and to expend energy to actively transport it into our cells, where it's then taken up into the nuclei and mitochondria. It's definitely a valuable antioxidant. In fact, this guy from Johns Hopkins feels like it ought to be actually classified as a vitamin. But ergothioneine is only manufactured in some bacteria and in mushrooms. So if you don't eat those things to get ergothioneine into your system, then you would need to eat something else that has concentrated it. Um, Here's one: fruiting bodies of selected edible mushrooms as a potential source of lovastatin. I especially appreciated this study because I've known for a long time about lovastatin. It's one of the statin drugs that reduce cholesterol. I've known for a long time that that's found in kind of low pharmaceutical levels in oyster mushrooms. This study, though, actually looked at it in chanterelle mushrooms and found that there are equally high and even possibly slightly higher levels in wild chanterelle mushrooms. That's kind of cool. Mushrooms magnify memory by boosting nerve growth. This is something that is in this study. They're actually looking at it in humans for the first time. I've seen studies that have been done in mice and seem to be very effective. And a lot of people are aware of these studies. And so we've seen a much greater interest in the last, I'd say, 5 to 7 years of people that have heard about the nerve growth factors in lion's mane and want to incorporate more lion's mane into their diet. But this is the first study I'm aware of that's showing actually studies in humans that function. A randomized controlled clinical trial examining the effects of cordyceps militaris. So cordyceps is a really interesting one for a couple of reasons. One is that some of the influence for our awareness of this is coming from The Last of Us video game and the TV series, where there's a fictional relative of cordyceps, I suppose, that is infecting humans. But in the real world, cordyceps and others like it, like Ophiocordyceps, are parasitic on insects. And we find them in the fall on these ants when the leaves are off of the shrubs. We can walk around the property and find these ants with these fruiting bodies coming out behind the head where they've been infected, and they get turned into a zombie, and basically they climb up about waist high onto a branch and they bite into the underside of that branch, and then they never move again. And the fungus finishes spreading through them and fruits and drops spores all over their colony and infects more of them. It's kind of a cool thing. So that's an unusual one where their food source is actually other living things, like they're parasites on living things. So to sort of summarize where it looks like the trends are going, here's a projection of the functional mushroom market, where it's been and where it's heading. It's looking at about an annualized 12.1% growth. That's a lot of growth. That would be really good if you could put your money in a bank account that's making 12.1% growth. You'd be doing great. But they're looking at it doubling in the next few years. This is for specifically functional mushrooms. For mushrooms in general, just culinary mushrooms, it's slightly under 10%, but still a lot. There's a lot of growth. This is an industry that's growing rapidly. There is tremendous growth in interest in this. And so we have to be aware of that, and we have to be working towards that. Going back to that influencer that had that lovely meal with chestnut mushrooms, I want to show you something about that. That kind of relates to this interest and where our level of knowledge is. On the left is some of our cultivated chestnut mushrooms from the farmer's market. That cultivated chestnut is Foliota adiposa, and it was one of our biggest sellers at the market. People really, really liked it. And on the right is a wild one that I find sometimes out in the woods. I found this one in the woods just north of here. It's a golden Foliota, so a different species of Foliota. And what's of particular interest to me is that the mushroom field guides all list the golden Foliota as not edible, and they say that there are reports of people having GI distress after eating it. The reason I find that interesting is that the chestnut mushrooms There are reports of people having GI distress after eating these commonly cultivated mushrooms as well. One of those people is my wife. She can't eat them. She will have intense GI distress from eating them. And we had several customers that were very much the same, to the point where we really learned that we had to tell everybody who bought them, if they'd not eaten them before, uh, make sure you just eat a little bit the first day, try it and see how you do. And then if you do good with it, then the next day you can eat more. But we found that we really needed to start warning people. And it kind of makes me wonder. It kind of makes me wonder if really all foliota may be similar to the golden foliota, where in a guidebook it would be considered not safe to eat. Here's a list of the 2017 position statement in North Carolina that lays out what wild mushrooms can legally be collected and sold to food establishments by certified experts. There's 16 varieties here, and that chestnut mushroom is not on that. And the thing I want to bring up next, I want to be very clear that I'm not throwing anybody under the bus. I'm not laying any blame, because North Carolina is, like everybody, working to keep up with the new demand and the changing world. And North Carolina is changing the regulations to reflect new knowledge and to reflect where the interest is. But um, currently, this food code applies to food establishments like restaurants. But if you're selling mushrooms at a farmer's market, that is covered by Department of Agriculture, and the Department of Agriculture has no real regulations about it. But when I reached out to a compliance officer and asked them about trying to find some regulations, I got an email back listing 17 varieties that they feel like they don't have a problem with people using. And that list is the 16 in the food code plus shiitake. So, from their point of view, they're fine with the wild mushrooms plus shiitake, which doesn't include, it only includes one species of oyster. It doesn't include golden oyster, pink oyster, king oyster. It doesn't include chestnuts or piopino or uh, lots of other fairly common cultivated mushrooms. It's just not in there. And when I reached back to that compliance officer to say, is this actually sat down in the books somewhere, or is this just kind of the word of mouth? What's kind of okay? It's not written down anywhere even. And to me, um, that creates an issue. And it creates an issue because it means that there's no way to really comply with the food code and to know that you're complying with safety regulations if the safety regulations aren't clearly articulated and enforceable and known by people. And so to me, that makes the people collecting the mushrooms or cultivating the mushrooms unsafe. It makes the people, uh, the chefs in restaurants to some extent unsafe, and the restaurants themselves, and it makes the final consumers unsafe. So I'm a big advocate for clear, enforceable, followable regulations. Uh, and just a couple more quick examples. These are two of the commonly collected mushrooms in North Carolina that are approved for collection and sale in North Carolina and in many other states. On the left is chicken of the woods, on the right is a honey mushroom. Both of these are ones that, if you don't know how to use them correctly, they could make you sick. Or so, chicken of the woods, if it's not well cooked, very commonly makes people ill. If it's not well cooked, it won't kill you, but it'll make you ill. And honey mushrooms are kind of similar to chestnut mushrooms in that there's quite a few people, again, including my wife and several other people I've met, who will get sick from eating them even if they're well cooked. It's just one that people are commonly sensitive to, which has led me to produce these slips whenever I teach a certification class here in North Carolina. My students get a PDF of this, and I encourage them to give this to everybody who buys mushrooms from them. Tells people how to store the mushrooms, how to use them, how to cook them, make sure all mushrooms are thoroughly cooked, and then also encourages people, if they're eating a mushroom for the first time, to try a little bit first before they eat a lot. This slide was just to show you where the USDA guidelines are with mushrooms. If you look through the 150 pages or whatever about inspecting different foods, there's exactly one mushroom mentioned. They just call it mushrooms. It's just button mushrooms, and doesn't even resemble the gourmet mushrooms that we were producing, and that many others are producing. And so there's no real guidance there. So the fundamental challenge of mushrooms in our food system is lack of familiarity. The consumers don't know much about them. Regulators don't know much more than the consumers. And we really need smart, safe regulations. And we need to push for outreach and training on all sides. Outreach and training for the people that are producing and collecting them. Outreach and training for the regulators. Outreach and training for the consumers. We can make it a cultural thing, but it's going to take some effort. And my final thing on this final slide is that it's effort worth making. These mushrooms are, they're not only good for you, they are important ways that we connect with the land where we live. And to my mind, they are a very democratic food. You know, there is food out there waiting in the woods that you can walk out and collect. And to cultivate it, it doesn't take a lot of space. It doesn't take $250,000 pre-made chamber. It's not hard to do. Anyway, that's the presentation. I appreciate it. If you have any questions, hit me up in the comments, or if you have any comments, hit me up in the comments. And I thank you for your time.